On the evening of January 31st, 1953, the coastlines of the North Sea experienced the flood of the century. It marked one of the deadliest natural disasters in Europe's modern history. Everyone was caught off guard, and the consequences were devastating. Particularly in the Netherlands, the catastrophe wasn't just about the staggering loss of thousands of lives and the obliteration of tens of thousands of homes. It was a wake-up call. This event, seared into Dutch history as Watersnoodramp, which literally means the flood, would reshape the nation's relationship with its coastline for decades to come. Determined not to let anything like this happen again, the Netherlands embarked on an unprecedented mission, building formidable barriers to fend off nature's wrath. For the next 50 years, the Dutch erected huge coastal barriers that would protect them from even the most powerful storms. And it worked. The Delta Works, as this barrier was named, quickly became the poster child of hard concrete coastal defense. Neighboring Germany and other countries learned from the Dutch, and soon, large concrete dikes became the norm in Europe and elsewhere. But all was not well. Environmental scientists have long highlighted the many flaws of hard engineering coastal defense. Large concrete barriers increase erosion in some areas and cause excessive sedimentation in others. They destroy habitats and disrupt tidal dynamics, affecting the entire coast. They affect the quality of sandbanks, vegetation, and dunes in the area. In short, concrete barriers can have unforeseen and often disastrous consequences for the environment. At the same time, as climate change drives sea level rise and more devastating storm surges, protecting our coastlines has never been more important. And herein lies the conundrum: what to do? We could just keep building bigger dikes and barriers at the expense of the environment. But that's incredibly expensive and not even an option for the hundreds of millions of people living along the coasts of developing nations. Or we could instead look to nature itself for help. Enter the fascinating world of nature-inspired coastal management. In this video, you'll learn how natural systems, from corals and sand dunes to salt marshes and mangroves, protect the world's coasts, and how we can leverage this. You'll also learn how a small German town backed away and let nature reclaim its marshlands. In the process, their coastline is now much more secure. Wildlife is flourishing, and there are even new tourists, a win-win for both people and nature. Yet nothing about this transformation was easy, as you shall see. The story of Langwarder Groden starts in 1933 when the German government built a summer dike in the area to reclaim new land from the sea for farming. Unlike main sea dikes meant to protect the inland from storm surges and high tide, a summer dike is designed to isolate salt marshes from regular tide dynamics during the growing season. In time, Langwarder Groden's salt marshes were severely degraded. Once a flourishing wildlife ecosystem, the polder turned into a run-off-the-mill grazing ground for cattle and sheep. But then, in the early 2000s, a new harbor was established in the area called Jade-Wessert Port. The new deep-water port quickly boosted the region's economy, but also caused a lot of disruption to the local ecosystems. The German environmental protection law calls for offsetting in such situations. So to compensate for their environmental damage, the local government ordered the harbor developers to revive tidal habitats in the then barren Langwarder Groden. The idea of the new rewilding project was to open the summer dike to expose the polder to natural tide dynamics, thereby reviving the salt marsh with natural creeks and regular saltwater flooding of the intertidal zone. Essentially, the plan was to give back some of the agricultural lands to the sea, and it worked.
So in this specific case, you have one main dike in the land, which has a very high protection standard. Then you have towards the sea a little bit grassland or wetlands or something like that. Then you have a smaller dike, a summer dike. It's called summer dike. And the summer dike protects during the whole year, also the area in between the main dike and the summer dike. But if there are strong storm surges, the water can flow over the summer dike into the area between the two dikes.
We got the main dike on that end and the summer dike on this, and the summer dike got opened. Before the summer dike was opened, this place was used for agriculture, and there was not many species of birds or species also of plants left, so it was not very biodiverse. It was just used for grazing of cattle.
The advantages are that during normal high tide and low tide, you have salt marsh development in the area between the dikes. So it's a very unique fauna and flora, and you would like to maintain it because normally the salt marshes are outside the dike. But with rising sea level, it's not clear if sedimentation processes also keep the balance with the sea level rise. And there might be the danger that salt marshes will drown into the salt water. And then a very, very unique habitat is lost. So the salt marshes are very, very valuable for breeding birds, for example. They take their rest in the salt marshes before they go down to the south and so on. And as I said, it's very unique. It's a World Heritage Site.
In 2014, the Langwarder Groden became tidal with the last opening of the drainage channel to the Fetterwarder Tidal Creek. Since then, the place has undergone a major metamorphosis, transitioning from a hard barrier into a dynamic, hybrid system where man-made engineering and nature work hand in hand to protect the shoreline. Nature has returned and is thriving, much to the delight of wildlife. Once a barren wasteland of overgrazed agricultural lands, the site is now home to many coastal birds that have returned to the area, including redshanks, avocats, ringed plovers, and meadow pipits.
So von der Naturschutzseite her nicht mehr viel los. Es waren nur noch wenig Vögel da und auch sonst, ja, es war einfach wenig da. Und jetzt durch die Sommerdeichöffnung hat das Meer alles wiedergebracht. Die Flächen waren direkt nach der Öffnung, war einfach schwarze Erde und das Meer bringt alles mit, was es braucht. Das Meer hat die Pflanzen zurückgebracht und mit den Pflanzen kommen natürlich auch gleich die Vögel wieder und die anderen Insekten. Und jetzt ist von dieser ruhigen Landschaft mit vor der Öffnung des Sommerdeichs mit ungefähr vier, fünf Brutpaaren von Rotschenkeln zu jetzt. Aktuell sind wir bei über 80 Rotschenkelpaaren.
The summer dike was opened only at certain sections over a length of 900 meters. These breaches were designed so that the daily tide flows in and out in a controlled manner. In time, the Langwarder's historic salt marshes were revived. Salt marshes are unsung heroes of the shoreline. They protect coastlines from surges and storms by creating a responsive buffer area between the mainland and the sea. They also build up the coastline by trapping sediment and holding it together.
You have other services like a buffer zone for storm surges. If there is a storm surge and the water can flow into an area between the dikes, it releases the pressures on another side. So not the whole storm surge is coming to the mainland and has to be stopped at the dike. There is one area with this buffer zone, so the pressure release somehow from the sides next to it. So this has also a coastal protection function.
If there is a salt marsh, you don't need to build the dike as high as if there isn't. And we want to show how it could be when you incorporate, for example, salt marshes more into planning. If you really work on having more salt marshes, for example, not just thinking of the ones that are there, but also how you can widen them, how you can work on getting more of the benefits of it.
The question is, when sea level rise, where will the water go? And by providing this kind of solution, provide another buffer area where water can go to some amount. If the water then finds its way to a kind of safe place, it won't flood properties. So that's why I think the good interpretation, as you mentioned, a combination of is what we call nature-based solution, which has some degree of engineering on the one hand, but also let nature take its own way on the other. That's a very good combination.
Although nature was left to do the heavy lifting, the entire area is guided by the human hand to achieve very specific outcomes. A staggering 650,000 cubic meters of soil was excavated and moved around, including for the main dike reinforcement. Higher lying areas that are not exposed to the daily tide are now covered in saltgrass, which the cattle and sheep love to graze. But it's not just animals that love Langwarder Groden. There's a nature experience trail, complete with guided pathways and bird-watching spots. Many locals, but even more tourists, now visit the site to experience a rare glimpse of wild nature.
Das heißt, die Leute, die Einheimischen und auch die Touristen können kommen und diese tolle Natur hier erleben und sie wirklich erleben, sie ist ganz nah. Sie können auf den Wegen laufen und können von da aus die Vögel sehen, die Küken von den Vögeln, die Seehunde und wirklich Nationalpark richtig erleben.
For the people in Langwarder Groden, like many coastal communities, building and managing dikes was a fact of life for centuries. This is why this opening is so striking. But the story of Langwarder Groden was in no way straightforward. The people were initially terrified. They thought the main dike wouldn't protect them, and that they would lose some of their cultural heritage. Locals from the nearby town of Federwerdersiel feared that opening up the summer dike would make them more vulnerable to flooding. Rewilding the area also meant some farmers had to give up some of the land they were using for grazing. Although they were compensated and a part of the area is still used for grazing, people initially hated the idea. This all culminated with striking protests that ended up overturning the initial plans for the opening of the summer dike.
As it was constructed in the 1930s, it was, or it is, part of the history of the culture of the people living here. And I think all the people, or many people, got scared. Of course, the loss of cultural heritage, but also the loss of safety. Everyone, when you talk about opening a dike, everyone gets scared of their own safety. And I think that was the main problem. So, yeah, and there was not much communication. So it was the lack of communication that everyone felt a little bit unsafe, maybe. And yeah, I think that was the biggest problem in the development of the place. But when they involved all the stakeholders, all the people living here, everyone got closer and got more understanding of the idea, what's going to happen here. And I think by now, all the stakeholders that were involved, or all the stakeholders also that are living here, are quite happy about this development because, yeah, they got to see what can happen if you think out of the box.
The protests were so fierce that the project almost never happened. But eventually, after lengthy discussions and after involving all stakeholders, an acceptable compromise was reached. In the end, despite the initial setbacks, everything turned out amazingly for everyone involved. In only a decade, Langwarder Groden has become unrecognizable. Moreover, among the now biodiversity-rich salt marsh, there is still room for the town's iconic cattle and sheep. The story of Langwarder Groden serves as an inspiration that highlights the power of nature-based solutions, a huge field that goes far beyond salt marshes and flood barriers. This is just one example of what experts increasingly refer to as building with nature. nature-based solutions leverage nature and the power of healthy ecosystems to protect people, optimize infrastructure, and safeguard a stable and biodiverse future. Often described as building with nature or environmental co-design, nature-based strategies are all about weaving diverse natural processes and ecosystems into our coastal infrastructure. This green engineering approach contrasts with the traditional gray engineering, things like big concrete dikes, which often work against the environment. In green engineering, nature becomes a main stakeholder. It does some of the work, but it also gets some of the benefits. This isn't something exactly novel. Historically, humans have relied on nature for coastal protection for centuries. Building with nature often involves creating or restoring habitats that benefit both communities and local wildlife. Some examples include salt marshes, mangroves, dunes, and coral reefs, which serve as shields against storm surges and rising sea levels. Although each coastline has its unique characteristics, there is no shortage of nature-based solutions to choose from. Dunes act as a barrier between the land and the sea. When waves or storm surges crash onto the shore, they absorb the brunt of the impact, reducing the force of the waves and preventing or reducing flooding and erosion inland. Plants that grow on dunes can also stabilize the sand with their extensive root systems. Some of the oldest coastal management practices revolve around dunes. For instance, the most common way to protect dunes is by putting up fences and planting vegetation, which is exactly how people used to do centuries ago. But while dunes used to be very common along shorelines, today, not so much. It all can be traced back to the 19th century, when people, particularly in Europe and the United States, became wealthier and gained more free time. Among their new pastimes was going to the beach, not to solely fish and work as they had before, but rather just for fun. This new influx of sunbathers birthed a new thriving tourism industry, but it also ruined the dunes. Virtually wherever humans have built on the coast, sand dunes have suffered. To make matters even worse, climate change and subsequent extreme weather accentuate dune erosion. But dune restoration projects can help reverse some of the problems. In Fiji, for instance, dune management is expected to play a key role in building community climate resilience. In South Africa, a sand trapping system was used to build up sand in the dunes, supplementing the natural deposition of sand. And in countries with long coastlines like the US or Brazil, dunes are increasingly in the limelight for coastal protection. However, not all natural coastal defenses are on land. In fact, some are underwater. Coral reefs are vibrant underwater ecosystems formed through the accumulation of calcium carbonate secreted by tiny coral polyps. But there's more to these coral colonies than just a haven for marine life, or their beauty. They also act as protective walls against the might of waves, floods, and storms. Because of their hard and jagged structure, coral reefs can reduce wave energy by a whopping 97%. This also ensures that water in the backside of the reef is calm, which supports the trapping and accretion of sediment. Although they cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, coral reefs provide homes to nearly a quarter of all known marine species.
Coral reefs protect shorelines from erosion by their basic principle of growth and accumulation of carbonate of limestone. Only some corals can capture particular elements of the water and cement these skeletons. And this process takes years and years, but that's how they build a sort of strong limestone-made structure that breaks the waves as they are incoming to the land. When there's storms that could generate high waves breaking onto the shore that could result in flooding, they also protect coastlines from floods.
Reefs are rarely assessed for their coastal protection service. Instead, conservation often centers on the economic and marine wildlife benefits that these reefs provide. To get an idea of how much of a difference reefs can make, you only need to look at the small fishing town of Grenville in the Caribbean island state of Grenada. In 2004, Hurricane Ivan struck the community with a fury, devastating local infrastructure. At least part of why it was so devastating was that the local reefs had been severely damaged. After Hurricane Ivan struck the community, researchers at the University of California, Santa Cruz and the Nature Conservancy showed that a relatively small patch of healthy coral reefs can keep more than half of Grenville Bay's coastline stable and in equilibrium. The researchers embarked on a coral reef restoration project called At the Water's Edge, which used economical, locally sourced materials and labor to rebuild coral reefs. Live coral fragments from the existing reef were artfully positioned to facilitate the natural proliferation of coral reefs, and the results speak for themselves. The artificial reef became a hub for biodiversity while also offering protection to the northern portion of Greenville Bay. A similar approach could be deployed and scaled to other areas. Tropical developing nations and small island states, in particular, are best suited for coral reefs. However, reconstructing reefs is not a simple process. Communities that are serious about reforming their reefs need to first consider what destroyed the coral in the first place and take steps so it doesn't happen again.
If the community is thinking of establishing a reef in a place that used to be one and it died, the first consideration is to, look into what killed it, I would say. It's the most obvious thing. What was it? Was it a heat wave? Is there a river that is throwing pollutants that are that are not conducive to coral growth? And so the first measure would be to mitigate whatever's going on to maximize the success of a future reef developing there.
Since corals can be very vulnerable to pollution and climate change, reef management is certainly not for everyone. But tropical communities could turn to another sturdy ally: mangroves. Super Typhoon Haiyan, known as Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines, was one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded. It made landfall on November 8, 2013, causing unprecedented destruction in the Philippines. Haiyan developed roof-tearing winds of up to 200 miles per hour, wreaking havoc across the nation. The storm wiped entire communities off the map and caused a tragic loss of life.
This is probably one of the top 12, so the top dozen of all storms ever seen on this planet with a satellite or in person. That's how big this is.
But in this sea of destruction, the quaint coastal town of Palampon on Leyte Island somehow weathered the storm. Palampon still suffered severe damage, but relative to its neighboring cities, it came out significantly less battered. What offered Palampon its edge was a natural barrier against storm surge: a mangrove forest. The mangrove plantation is located only a few hundred meters from the shoreline on a small island called Tabuk. While other communities cut down their mangroves to make way for development, the Tabuk mangroves were declared a fish and bird sanctuary in 1995. After the island became protected, fish started spawning like crazy, and the local fishermen were ecstatic. But even though the conservation program was self-interested, the mangroves would show their true worth nearly 2 decades later once Haiyan arrived.
We've seen examples after heavy storm surges, and even when you look at tsunamis, like in 2004, I think it was, of course, the mangroves also can get destroyed by that, but still, even upon being destroyed, they slow down the water movement and they protect infrastructure, including villages that are placed just behind the mangroves. So there's a couple, I wouldn't call it statistically sound because it's really just anecdotal observation, but there's a couple of observations where we can relatively clearly see that villages behind mangroves were better protected, less severely destroyed than villages that were on an open coast. So we certainly believe that mangroves and other coastal ecosystems as well protect the coast and the people living there from storm surges.
Not counting the value they bring by restoring fisheries and ecosystems, mangroves offer protection from severe weather events for an estimated 2.4 billion people who live within just 100 kilometers of the coast. They attenuate wind-driven waves as they pass through the forest and dampen storm surges through friction. Mangroves also store up to 5 times more carbon per hectare than the mighty tropical rainforests.
many of these ecosystems, specifically mangroves, can kind of grow vertically. They accrete sediment and by this grow vertically and can, through this, also counteract sea level rise, which means there we come from climate change mitigation to climate change adaptation, because this is kind of a future development where these ecosystems will help coastal societies and coastal settlements in the future getting along with sea level rise.
But it's not like mangroves are an easy fix. There are nearly 80 different species of mangroves, and they all need low oxygen soil, where slow-moving waters allow sediments to accumulate, and tropical and subtropical conditions near the equator to thrive. You cannot plant these trees in areas where you experience even one single day of freezing. Sometimes nature-based infrastructure alone may not be enough to protect shorelines. So what if we gave it a bit of extra help? Recent research shows that once in a century, floods could become yearly by the end of the century. So how do we defend our shores sustainably in this new normal?
We really cannot discriminate, because obviously nobody likes the engineering solutions like high walls, high dikes, or huge steel doors as they use in Holland. So therefore, nature-based solutions are preferred one, but they have two disadvantages. They take a long time. Talk about decades until a mangrove can be reconstructed, and they're also quite fragile as well. So that they can also be we can build a mangrove, and then comes a big hurricane and destroys it. So they're quite fragile. So therefore, we need a combination of both, really. The hard, but also the nature-based solution.
This strategy hinges on a hybrid infrastructure. It fuses the strength of natural and artificial elements. While artificial barriers like seawalls offer immediate coastal protection, it can pose future challenges. Natural defenses, on the other hand, are initially fragile, but grow robust over time. When combined with man-made structures, a powerful synergy can be unleashed.
I think in many cases, nature-based solutions might be more suitable or more suited for a given solution or given problem. But it's also probably true that a combination of both might help a lot. So I don't see any reason why we would not combine planting a mangrove or salt marsh with building a fence or a dike, at least for some time, to help the ecosystem develop. And then these combined green-gray infrastructure would probably solve the solution or solve the problem when it comes to protection of ports or harbors or coastal villages.
Hybrid engineering may be the best solution in some cases in a future increasingly threatened by climate change. But given the associated costs and what we still don't know about their long-term benefits, this is no panacea either. In fact, implementing any nature-based solution can be a major challenge. Nature-based solutions paired with or without modern engineering offer great promise for coastal protection and are here to stay. But that doesn't mean they can be universally applied. At the end of the day, every solution must cater to the specific needs and resources of the local community and ecosystem.
Why I personally do not believe we can kind of copy-paste, like a blueprint type, a solution from, say, northern Germany, where we are working, to the Colombian Caribbean coast or the west coast of Africa, whatsoever. That will not work properly because of the societal difference, not so much because of the ecosystem differences. That also, of course, play an important role. But I think the societal aspect is much, much more important here.
It's not all smooth sailing. Nature-based solutions take time, and funding remains a significant hurdle. While they may prove economical in the long run, the initial costs can be substantial. Even though restoring degraded wetlands and mangroves involves building with nature's help, that doesn't mean it's free. For instance, beach nourishment meant to combat coastal erosion often requires dredging sand offshore up to dozens of kilometers from the coastline. This requires a lot of very expensive and heavy machinery and qualified labor. Some mega projects can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And ironically, in some situations, a nature-based solution may be too cheap.
cities like New York, for example, which are quite vulnerable, San Francisco, to go for these large solutions. But in terms of developing countries, Caribbean region, South Pacific, but also in Africa, they have a different mentality. And there's not a big interest from donor agencies, or at least most of them, to fund, small ones. They want to go for large scale ones. If a bank like the African Development Bank wants to give a loan, they'll give a loan to $50-60 million, not to $300,000. That's also another part of the problem as well.
Moreover, many coastal regions remain under-researched, making targeted intervention a challenge. Overall, the key seems to lie in effective communication and local engagement. In places like Langwarder Groden, for instance, inclusive communication from the project's outset was the key to its success.
It all starts with talking to the people. And from even before you plan the project, you have to go there, you talk to people and tell them, look, we have the idea, we would like to do this and that. What do you think about it? Would you be in for it? And they are in for it, but they want to be involved. And that's the major first step, because then they feel ownership and they feel stewardship and take care of everything. Then site selection is extremely important, and the species selection is extremely important. Again, taking into account maybe the ecosystem co-design approach, where we might select or choose among species depending on whether we are going for coastal protection, whether we are going for sediment accretion in terms of fighting sea level rise, whether we go for blue carbon sequestration. Different species of mangroves do the different jobs differently well, depending on what we want. And again, this is not what we want, this is what the local people want. And then it's very important that over the next 5, 10, 15 years, there's a monitoring program. We cannot go there, plant the trees, and then go home. And again, the monitoring, of course, needs to involve the local people. They feel ownership, they do it, and they know how to do it.
Like in every field of action, you have a lot of people, you had a lot of interests that are clashing. So I think that's a big problem or a big thing to think about, communication between the different stakeholders. So if you want to convince people to think about nature-based solutions, it's super important to incorporate them, to educate them in a way that they get to know the benefits, but also, of course, the negative things.
If people don't buy in, it won't work.
Although nature-based solutions can render fantastic results, in some situations there may be no feasible option. Many of the experts we interviewed say we simply can't protect all areas and everyone. If that's the case, what can we do? There's an option of last resort, but it's also bound to be the most unpopular by a wide margin: a managed retreat. Managed retreat isn't just about picking up your bags and abandoning a coastal area. It's a strategic decision to withdraw from an area, which you continue to manage proactively. When a coastal area is conceded to the sea, it becomes a natural buffer zone that improves protection against flooding. This is exactly what happened in the case of Langwarder Groden.
In other places, it just would make more sense to transition people away from these hazard zones, and that just sort of relocate. In some places, that's already happening. People are abandoning some coastal lowlands and moving to higher ground, and that's the cheaper option. So it just depends, I guess, what opportunity, what is the exposure, and what is the adaptive capacity in the economy to bring in some of these more expensive solutions. So,
of course, people won't like it. The case in Langwarder Groden highlights just how heated things can become, especially when land with cultural and historical significance is at stake. People near Langwarder Groden resisted, concerned that by opening up the summer dike, they would face an existential risk despite what the science says. NGOs were formed, protests were organized, and politicians were involved. The whole project was delayed by nearly a decade. In the end, everyone was happy with the result, but the entire process was quite messy. This is why imposing a managed retreat is a bad idea, and is destined to fail. It only works if people are on board and do it on their own accord.
I think it is unpopular because these concepts usually don't include and incorporate the local people in the decision making. I think this is often something that is kind of put from kind of top down by local, regional, or maybe even national governments. And this again is the problem. And it's called ecosystem co-design because again, this process has to be done together with the local people. There's nothing we can impose on them top down.
Historically, settlements were strategically placed behind natural barriers for protection. Today's coastal urbanization is a challenge of our own making. But there is still hope. The big takeaway here is that, despite the many perils and unforeseen challenges that lie ahead, nature-based solutions are here to stay. As we continue to grapple with climate change, places like the unsuspecting Langwarder Groden serve as important success stories.
Dann wurde immer probiert, dem Meer ein bisschen Land abzuknapsen, was total verständlich ist. Das war wirklich ein hartes, schweres Leben hier, was die Leute hatten. Und an diesem Ort hat man gesagt, hey, und jetzt sind wir dran, jetzt geben wir dem Meer was zurück. Und hat es geöffnet und das Meer konnte wieder hier in die Fläche kommen. Und das ist so toll, dass wir Menschen gesagt haben, okay, nee, in diesem Bereich, da geht das, da können wir öffnen und der Natur, also dem Meer was zurückgeben. Und das macht es wirklich besonders hier.
By now it's become clear that concrete won't solve all our problems. Shorelines have always been living, breathing ecosystems. It's time to go back to the roots.
Habt keine Angst vor Wildnis.
Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to ZME Science for more of our engaging science journalism.